Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health webinar series. We're just going to wait half a minute for people to slowly roll in before we get started today. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. The topic is striking a balance, tips and tricks for effective student engagement. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Participants are on mute while we are on the call, so you're in listen-only mode. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar, what you can do is that if you look at the little menu that's popped up for you, there's a question function and there is also a chat function. So if throughout the webinar you have any little quick comments or questions or anything that you want to ask our presenters, feel free to use that chat function. But there's also the question function that you can use if you have like much larger questions that you want to take a deeper dive into. Put that into the question function and we'll take that up around the last 10 to 15 minutes. The webinar is being recorded and it's going to be made available on our website, and the presentation slides are also available to download. If you click under handouts, you should be able to download a PDF copy of the presentation slides. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes to complete it as the feedback is really valuable to us. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Perlin Ng. I am the Research and Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the Center. And we are joined today by Pratik Nair and Sarah Mogul from Jack.org. I think I messed up your name, Pratik. I'm so sorry. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm just going to turn it over to you guys.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on tips and tricks for effective youth engagement. Thank you, Perlin, for that introduction. My name is Pratik. I am the Evaluation and Knowledge Translation Lead here at Jack.org, and I'm joined today by Sarah, who's our Director of Programs and Evaluation here at Jack.org. Before we get started, just to do some housekeeping, you now know who we are. We'd love to know who you are. So if you could take sort of 1 or 2 minutes and sort of throw an introduction there in the chat function, who you are, how you sort of interact with young people or sort of invested in this presentation, and where you are geographically. We'd love to know who we're being joined by all across Canada. We have about 40 minutes of content that we'll go through, and at the end we've reserved about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Again, please use that question feature, or that chat feature rather, that Perlin introduced for any questions you may have, and we'll get to that at the very end. So if all that sounds good, we're going to get right into it. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to speak a little bit about who we are at Jack.org.
Excellent. So we thought we would give a quick overview around who we are and what Jack.org is, just to tell you why we have any credibility speaking about this, and to give you an overview of the lens that we're coming from. So we are Jack.org. We exist, we're a national charity, but our staff team is based here in Toronto. We have 35 staff here in our head office. And we support young people across the country, mostly students, but also young people in different communities, to take action on mental health in whatever way they see most relevant in their communities across the country. So we do that through our 3 main programs, which we're going to sort of not talk about in too much detail, but they are our Jack Talks program, our Jack Chapter program, and our Jack Summit program. And all of these exist to train and support young people to identify the biggest barriers to mental health and wellness in their communities, whether that's knowledge or stigma or inaccessible services, and to take action on those barriers or against those barriers through our programs. Just to give you a sense of scope, we currently, in our Jack Chapter program, which are clubs of young people doing this work in a year-round way in their communities, we have 207 registered Jack chapters. They currently exist in every province and territory, with over 2,000 young leaders making up this group. They have 690 initiatives last year, and we're geared to do about the same this year, which is the activities and events that they do. And they've had over 120 meaningful interactions or conversations with their peers, where they've either taught something about mental health, or worked to decrease stigma, or worked to build support for more accessible services. So just scaling out and what this has to do with youth engagement or student engagement, we as a staff and all of our programs exist to support and train young leaders in co-designing these initiatives to have the best possible impact on our youth population. So everything we do is a giant youth engagement program where we work to balance our expertise as training and capacity building programming staff with youth expertise directly in their communities all across the country. And it's in this mental health education, promotion, or advocacy work in whatever way they see fit. So so what we're doing in this presentation is we're going to pull out and teach the best practices that we've learned about youth engagement, and we've broken it into 5 steps. But before we do that, we wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about what we mean by youth engagement and what lens we're bringing to this presentation. So for us, we really want to make sure that we've defined youth engagement as more than a one-time activity. So I find sometimes people approach youth engagement as they're like, we did our one youth engagement moment or our activity or our day or our step in our whole process, but then they never revisit their student engagement thing again. And we're very much the opposite of that. So we see youth engagement as an intentional, long-term, and actually resource-intensive process that folks should be prepared for. And it's a long-term commitment to collaboration and co-production with young people. So we see it as bringing together different forms of expertise, reflecting on the different expertise at the table. So whether it's like mental health, best practices, or evidence-based approaches to health promotion, which would be like what we might bring, with youth expertise around the needs of their communities or their peers or whatever they bring to the table in those different settings, and bringing it together to make effective work. So this could include things like services, health promotion plans, education campaigns, policies, strategies, initiatives, basically anything that exists to support young people or students and their mental health on campuses. And it has a wide range of possibilities, which is why we're hoping if you can fill in what lens you're bringing to this conversation, we might be able to tailor our work as we get into it. Mm-hmm. We also want to stress that youth engagement, while it might be more time intensive than people might anticipate, it is incredibly beneficial for everyone involved. So it is not only helpful for young people because young people can gain knowledge and skills and actually have entry into these spaces that they're so often not allowed in, like system design or service design, but it also means that the work that you do, it makes it better. It'll make it more relevant to the communities that you intend to work with. It'll make it more relatable to students because, frankly, I have no idea what students across Canada need. I know what I know, but I don't know their needs. And as we're hoping to prove in our presentation, it'll allow you to be more reactive and responsive to diverse student needs that evolve over time.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, youth engagement is for several different stakeholders. So like Sarah said, young people gain a lot of knowledge and skills through the youth engagement process. Of course, they will sort of grow up to be members of society who contribute to society, and so it's important that we invest in young people early. Adult allies should also be invested in this process, of course, because adult allies are sometimes parents and educators who care about young people. And we're hoping folks like you who work on issues that affect young people are, of course, internal stakeholders for this process of youth engagement. Importantly, what we're finding in our work is that there's more and more sort of external interest in youth engagement. So donors sort of reward youth engagement processes. Especially if they're sort of government, civic, public institutions, they have vested interest in investing early in young people. And of course, young people grow up to be adults. And for that reason, everyone is sort of involved in this youth engagement process and invested in it. It's important that we support them and allow them to grow so that they can become members of society who contribute to society in meaningful ways.
Excellent. So as I said before, we base this presentation off of a generalized version of what we do in our program. So we're going to go through our 5 steps to youth engagement, which is quite catchy, but we're hoping that makes it much more relevant than teaching you how our chapters, talks, and summit programs work in a more internal way. But before we do that, I think the best way to learn how to do something or learnings of something is to start by teaching of our earlier missteps and mistakes mistakes we learned that taught us ways not to do stuff, which helped us shape how we do it. So I want to go back to the year 2013. So when I was hired at Jack.Org, I was hired to start our Jack chapter program. And all we knew at that time is we wanted to work with young people across the country. We had 10 chapters in 10 universities in 3 provinces. And we needed to find a way to give students in these chapters tools to do youth-led work that was safe and supported and grounded in evidence. So we were figuring out what that kind of co-production, collaboration, youth engagement would look like. So what I did is I worked with this team. Now these are 4 of our students. They were really lovely Queen's students that I love this picture. But we worked with these students, and I sat with them and I said, okay, like, why might young people not be reaching out for help? And they all said, you know, there's rampant stigma at Queen's University. There's a lot of academic pressure. We talked about all these different things. And then we said, how might you be able to best get this message to your peers and students? And they were like, fun. Like, we want to show it's a light conversation. We want to make it fun. So we took that and we made these ideas, which we called these initiative guides. And we made these resources called initiative guides, and one of them was Be Ballsy, which was about having a ball pit that had all these trivia questions infused on these balls. It was the whole thing. And then the other one was called Ball. The initiatives don't matter, but they were these initiatives that were these fun ideas to start conversations with students at Queen's University. And we took these ideas and we packaged them up and we rolled them out across the country. So what happened in that moment is I had 10 chapters, and I had about 5 of them love these ideas. They were like, oh my God, awesome, I love it, I can do that immediately, it's working so well. But then I had about 5 chapters who hated them. I had a team that was like, this doesn't work here. Like, you know, ball pits is something our engineering, like, it's stupid, it's a dumb idea, we hate puns. And then more importantly, I had a chapter from a very at-risk community, a much more vulnerable community with a lot more addiction and self-harm. And they were like, we don't want to use fun. That seems unbelievably inappropriate. And I realized at that time that what I did is I had assumed that this one group of young people's ideas were actually the ideas of all young people. And I had forgotten to roll out that process of engaging young people in every context, right? I'd misunderstood the expertise I was looking for. And now what we do is so in that moment we were teaching young people what to do, and now we're working towards teaching young people everywhere how to engage in the process and how to co-design meaningful work. So we're not replicating one idea across the country. And when we speak to that, I love this diagram, but it's what we're working on now is a much more engaged process where we support leaders in each community and we support them to represent their diversity, and we're much clearer on what everybody's bringing to the table, right? So we can still bring our expertise of health promotion and best practices and mental health 101 and what stigma means and all that kind of stuff. But the youth expertise that we need is that leadership within each community around what all diverse young people might want and look for and how to have these conversations in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, that's the crux of this presentation. It's not a marketing presentation about how you can sort of adapt programs that exist to make them more attractive to young people. It's a presentation about how you can co-produce programs with young people, because we think that natural process of co-producing it with a young person creates a program that's more attractive to their peers, is sustainable and reactive, like we said at the beginning of this presentation. Mm-hmm. Important implications for us in sort of engaging through this youth engagement process has been that it builds capacity that empowers young people beyond the immediate project at hand. So in our talks program, you know, we train young people to be public speakers and to give presentations on mental health. Those presentation skills they can use beyond the Jack Talks program, and that's important to remember. The other thing, of course, is it allows for scalability. There's no way we could be in every province and territory across the country if it were Sarah and I and the 28 other staff here at our head office in Toronto. That's why it's important that we give tools, resources, and coaching to young people so they can work within their own communities and we can scale all over the country. And the most important thing possibly is that youth identified barriers change, and we want to be able to be responsive to that change. And the only way we can be responsive to that change is if young people are involved in the process. They're very good at identifying trends and identifying new barriers as they come up. We were once young people, but we're not anymore, and we don't live in sort of college dorms anymore. And it's important that we defer to them so that their lived experience is involved in this process.
Okay, so that brings us to the meat of our presentation. So as I said at the beginning, like that's a good story, hopefully, and this is what we do. But we really wanted to find a way to generalize it so that we could figure out so you could take what is useful for you and bring it to the work that you're doing in your schools and in your communities and in your youth mental health work across the country. So we've reflected internally on our 3 programs and on our processes and what the main elements are that make youth engagement effective and sustainable, and a real true co-production. And we have taken those 5 steps and we've brought them here now. So we will go through them one by one. We're going to try to riddle examples throughout it so that it really brings it to life. And we hope that it is useful for the work that you're doing in your own schools. So our first step that we have here is called reflection and preparation. And it's in this step that we ask you to really question, is youth engagement right for you? Do you have the time and the resources to commit to a true process of intentional youth engagement from start to finish? And also, what is your goal, right? What are you going to be making? What are you doing? What are we producing together? We can't just have a meeting and then do nothing with that. What are we trying to do with this youth engagement work? So this is the part where we consider what everyone is bringing to the table, why we're engaging youth in the first place. Like, are they going to teach us knowledge about their peers? Are they going to help us understand what is needed for accessible services? Also, what expertise do we need? What are we going to make together? And how long is this going to take, in setting clear goals? And it's basically thinking, you know, if we're doing co-creation, what are these different ingredients and how are we all going to fit together? And that said, we'll move on to how to do that.
Yeah, so before, at this stage, we asked that you sort of reflect on some important questions that we found helpful and guiding in our work. Some of those questions involve, you know, what is the common goal you share with young people? So it's important that you have an organizational goal for engaging with young people, but it's also important that young people are bought into that goal. There has to be a reason that young people feel strongly about the cause you're contributing to. With mental health for their peers, that's an easy one. It may be more difficult with something that seems to benefit your organization, but may not benefit immediately, at least, young people. It's important to articulate that. The other really important thing is, what is the primary goal of this youth engagement work? So, like Sarah said, it's an intentional, resource-intensive process. It's not sort of pizza lunch focus groups that are fun, but there has to be some sort of end goal to why you're engaging these young people, and it's really important that you articulate that at this stage. Another important thing to consider is that both young people and their adult partners in this partnership bring sort of expertise and qualities, and it's important to reflect on that. Young people bring sort of expertise around lived experience, yes, and that's an easy one to tick off, but they also bring other skills. You know, they go to school, and some of them have part-time work, full-time work, and it's important to realize that, you know, they may be professionals who have qualities already that they're bringing to the table. And in a similar way, of course, you are adult stakeholders with some experience in the field. You may bring content knowledge and a specific skill set. It's important to reflect on that. Something else that's really important to reflect on is what sort of community resources already exist in this area. There's no reason for you to duplicate work. It's important for you to know where you're adding value. And when I say there's no reason for you to duplicate work, it may be easier or more efficient to sort of jump on someone who's already doing this work and help them out and provide more resources there. Pool your resources together.
Absolutely.
In terms of immediate next steps, walking away from this webinar, some things you can do is have a youth engagement mission statement. Importantly, this mission statement shouldn't be about why you're engaging youth. It's about the end goal, the common goal that you and the young person sort of brings to this partnership. The second piece is around sort of role clarity and governance. Role clarity involves sort of delineation of how you split work. So, you know, the young person does this, and you do this, and you both bring it together at an agreed upon timeline, and that's where governance comes in. Governance doesn't necessarily mean a hierarchy. It could mean that, but doesn't have to be. More of what it means is an understanding of how you report back to folks and sort of meet deadlines, et cetera. Important thing, again, budget and commitment. This is a long, intensive process. It can't just be a series of meetings, you know, that you have every quarter. It's important that you recognize that there's sort of a human capacity that you have to sort of devote to this process. There's obviously budgetary constraints, and you have to work around that. It has to be aligned in your budget, and you have to commit to it long term. The last piece, and maybe the most important piece, is to establish systems for accountability. So it's sort of making sure that this work gets done, and who's responsible for the different moving parts. If it's done the right way, youth engagement work can be sort of long-term and have several moving parts, and you need to establish some sort of system for accountability so that nothing gets missed.
Great. So that's our first step, reflect. And now we reflected on the expertise and how these parts are going to fit together. And in our next step, we are going to do knowledge transfer. So the example that I always come back to is if I was like the health services at a campus or whatever, and I wanted to make a health promotion program, right? A very obvious reflection that I would have done is both the health promotion expertise. So what needs to be taught? Where are services? What are signs and symptoms? When do you need to reach out for help? Mental health 101, all of that kind of key meaty information. Also how to do health education, right? Youth expertise that's required in that situation would be, what are the myths? Like, what are the knowledge gaps in their peers? How do young people like to learn? Where are they? When are they going to be there? How do we get young people to show up for these presentations? How do we trick young people to listen to us talking about mental health? Because Lord knows they probably don't want to, right? So like there's the different types of expertise that we have to bring together. And now that we've done that reflection, our next step is to bring that knowledge from both sides. So first, the first part of this step is to build the knowledge of the young people that you're going to be working with in this process. So we don't need to make experts. We don't need to have, our young leaders go through med school or any of that, but we do need to develop their knowledge gaps so that they can meaningfully participate. So for example, in that health promotion example that I was just giving, young people cannot create education campaigns with you if we don't first build their knowledge of mental health 101 and all of those topics that we want them to teach to their peers. Or if you wanted young people to help you co-develop a service or a system or weigh in on what gaps there are in a campus community, you probably need to first teach them what services and systems are available and possibly even how the core budget and administrative systems within the university work. So the first step there is to fill in the youth knowledge gap so that they can meaningfully engage. On the second part of that, you need to regularly ask young people for their opinions and bring their knowledge to the table as well. So whatever expertise they offer to this process, so whether it's community knowledge, knowledge of their peers, knowledge of young people knowledge gaps, understanding of what makes things accessible or inaccessible for different young folks, what kind of costs are reasonable, all that kind of stuff. This is where you pull that out from the youth that you'll be working with so that it can be meaningfully integrated into this process.
Mm-hmm. Some important questions to ask yourselves at this stage is, what kind of knowledge do young people bring to these partnerships? So like Sarah said, some of it is lived experience around sort of being a young person in the community that you're working with, but some of it may be sort of baseline knowledge, right? So increasingly now what we're finding is that young people are more and more mental health literate. So they sort of know things about mental health that you take for granted years ago, and this is because of more sort of mental health talk in social media with Let's Talk. And it's important to recognize that they bring some sort of working knowledge to a partnership already. The other piece to sort of recognize is that you as an adult collaborator may be a content expert in an area. So for example, Sarah and I have full-time jobs working around mental health, and so we know a thing or two about mental health, we hope. So it's important that we sort of share the knowledge that we have with our young partners. The other thing to sort of recognize is, like we were saying in the beginning, you don't want to sort of impart every single piece of knowledge about mental health. We're not sort of graduating psychiatrists to our program, but they do need some form of baseline knowledge so they can contribute valuably. A good way to think about this is, coming into a meeting, in your organization, you may get briefing notes about what you're going to discuss in the meeting. In a similar way, young people need to be involved in that process of having some sort of baseline that they can work off so they can contribute meaningfully during meetings, etc. And the last piece to sort of recognize is, what benefit does this knowledge transfer have beyond the immediate common goal that you and the young person are working on? That's super important to recognize because, if we're working on projects about, poisonous toads, for example, it may be more difficult to get buy-in there, but something like mental health that, affects everyone, it's easier to get buy-in there. So it's important to recognize that they'd be more invested in this knowledge transfer process if the knowledge stays with them through their lives.
Perfect. So just to bring it to life a little bit, for us, I want to share that this is a whole series of trainings that we do. So again, we support young people to do mental health education and promotion initiatives across the country. So before they do any of that work, one of the things we put them through or ask that they do is our mental health advocacy training. And in that, we define leadership and advocacy. We encourage young people to reflect on both the needs of themselves and their peers around them. What does it mean to be a representative, for example? What does it mean to be an advocate responsibly? And we also teach comprehensive mental health 101. So the young people we're working with are products of their own communities. They might be quite well versed in these topics, but we also want to make sure that they have a common understanding of the messages that they will be teaching their peers.
And in terms of sort of next steps that you can walk away from this webinar doing is scoping out content. Like what are sort of what's the baseline knowledge that young people need to work with? Once you've done that, you can focus on different processes, and this is super important. I am a visual learner. I don't know what kind of learner you are, Sarah, auditory, visual, but it's important to focus on different processes because people have different learning styles. And providing young people options so they can opt into using an online platform if they'd like that, or opt into having a meeting face-to-face with you if they'd like that. Another important thing to recognize is that this is a two-way street. Like you're transferring knowledge to them, they're transferring knowledge to you, and it's important to sort of engage in a listening session. Just let them sort of air out any comments, opinions, etc. And this may be a challenge to not sort of jump in, especially when you're a content expert in the area. But it's important that you take a back seat and just ask questions and let young people ruminate on these important topics.
Mm-hmm. One rule of thumb that I've been using, that I always use in anything, is if I don't know the answer to something, so if we're sitting here being like, how come we can't get more young people to fill out our surveys? Oh my God. Or how come people aren't registering for our talks training as much as they used to be? It's like, oh, ask, right? Like if we don't know, we can probably ask the students we work with and they'll know the answers. Like maybe it's just like they like to submit stuff on a Sunday, right? Or it's exams and we didn't think about that. Or our forms are too long, which they often are, or things like that, right? So I think a good rule is if you don't know, you can always ask a young person, and that's where their expertise will come into play.
Sure.
Okay, so we've reflected, we've transferred knowledge, and our next step that we're bringing is to build skills. What are we going to do with that knowledge, and what do we need to do and learn and practice to properly act on this stuff that we want to do? So in this step, we are going to work to strengthen the skills of the youth team members so that they can engage meaningfully and effectively in this process. So think about the goal of your work. Are they going to be asked to give a presentation? Are they going to be asked to prepare a report, to engage in a meeting? And what skills need to be supported so that they can do so in a meaningful, professional, engaged manner? And it's sort of the snarky second paragraph that's here. And then the reason for that is I think we've all seen presentations or youth engagement things where a young person has been asked to get up on stage or show up at a meeting and give their opinion on something, and that's been an effort at youth engagement, which of course is an excellent thing to see. But then we've heard that this young people often is incredibly nervous, or they're sort of mumbling while they're speaking, or shuffled around, or they were not adequately prepared. And I've heard different people that have been in this space say, like that's because like they're a young person, like give them credit, like don't judge for that. And that's all well and good, and I agree with that. But I also think ultimately, if a young person hasn't been prepared to engage, then we've done a disservice in that moment, right? So the skill set is not what makes them young. The fact that they have not yet learned this content, or they are not as well versed in speaking publicly as we might be, or like whatever that skill is missing. The writing is not as polished. That is not because they're young, and we should take it that way. We should give that young person the opportunity through mentorship, capacity building, and skill development to really let their voice shine through. So this is a moment to sit back, really engage on what skills are required, and consider how everybody learns, everybody starts somewhere, and consider how we can develop those skills so that they can really shine.
Yeah, and to speak to that a little bit, what we found is there's no sort of work that's too far-reaching. As I'll sort of talk about towards the end of the presentation, more and more young people and communities want to engage in systems change work, and that's difficult work if you're not a policy analyst or a policy influencer. But what we found is through providing training and skills, we're able to sort of help them through that sort of grassroots process. Some of the things you may want to ask yourselves here is, again, similar to knowledge, what skills do young people already bring to these partnerships? In some cases, talk speakers come to us and they already have phenomenal public speaking skills, and that's totally fine. We can still work around sort of concepts of safe storytelling. There's still value we can add, but there's no reason for us to be patronizing and sort of give them a whole sort of public speaking workshop when they don't need it. And the other sort of important thing to remember is, what skills do you as the adult collaborator bring? These are skills that you can impart to young people. In similar to sort of the knowledge piece, you can think about effective ways to build these skills and give young people several different options. And again, important to remember how these skills will benefit young people beyond the immediate task at hand. If you have public speaking skills, you can see where that'd be effective in your professional career. And it's important to sell that in a way to young people so that you can generate more buy-in.
Perfect. So for us, one of the programs we have is our Jack Talks training, or our Jack Talks program, where we train young people to give a mental health education presentation in high schools largely across the country, and to weave their personal stories into them. Of course, we all know contact-based education makes messages much more effective, helps decrease stigma, makes content more relatable, and all of that. So in the reflection, what young people bring to that table is their stories and their experiences and their ability to be relatable in that environment. What young people often don't already know inherently is how to share those stories in a way that is safe, that avoids triggers, that is safe for both the audience to hear and for them to tell. So oftentimes students don't realize that this is the first time they're being asked to share a personal story in a public forum, and they haven't thought about what boundary setting is going to mean for them. And we put a really comprehensive training around that. And that's an example of, if that is an unpolished story and we don't put any of that skill building into that moment, a young person could get on a stage and share their very true story, but it could be a very negative experience for them. So we put a lot of effort into building our resources around how to share that story safely, so that the young person's expertise and skills and stories can shine in that education presentation. In addition, we have a lot of resources around speaker safety. So students, we want to make sure that we're training them to understand whether or not they're in a good place to participate in our talks programs. We don't make that call, absolutely not, but we want to make sure we've trained students to be able to do so. We have these speaker readiness assessment documents where they reflect on where they're at. We always say you can take a step back or you can come. We encourage them to create their own safety plan. We don't collect any of this stuff, but part of our program is to make sure we're training young people to identify their own boundaries, their own barriers, and take care of themselves while they're participating.
And in terms of next steps, one of the important things to recognize is that skills provide a way for young people to work with that knowledge that you've sort of provided them towards the common goal. And it works both ways, right? The knowledge they impart on you towards that common goal as well. So skills are crucial, they're very important, and they're specific to the goal you're looking to meet. And we'll also talk about this later, specific to the platform that you're providing them. Mm-hmm. An important thing to recognize is that you may not have sort of these skills on hand, and that's totally fine. If you don't have, if you're not working with folks who have terrific public speaking skills, for example, you may need to consult with experts in the space. And if you do have sort of people with public speaking skills that are they have that sort of content knowledge or skill, they may not be sort of experts around transferring those skills, and it's important to sort of consult with experts if you need help there. Mm-hmm. Another important focus is focusing on process. Again, people learn in different ways, and affording that flexibility and providing options is crucial. Mm-hmm. The last piece is super important, and that's providing sort of safe places for them to practice so they can feel comfortable, and providing them with timely feedback. For a lot of young people, these skills may be brand new. It may be sort of an uncomfortable thing to, sort of ask them to use them right away. So you want to give it some buffer time so that they have sort of due time to practice and collect feedback.
Yeah, and just before we move on to the next step, the thing that I would want to stress is really not to take this step for granted. Mm-hmm. So I've done this myself, where we've worked with different public speakers or different people, and you have the youth report, and the first draft, might not be as well written as it needs to be, or it might not be as thought out, or it's a first draft, right? And I think it's tempting to say, well, this is where it is, and this is what this youth engagement process looks like, and it's a little bit messy, or maybe these students don't have these training, there's 19, they haven't been trained to write in a certain polished professional way, but don't stop there, right? Everybody can learn, there's an eagerness to do good work, and I think making sure we breathe enough space for practicing, feedback, growth, and development is one of the most valuable pieces that people often miss in this step.
Absolutely, and sometimes, you know, young people get this carte blanche of like, you know, oh, they're young people, so they won't produce as great work. What we found anecdotally through our experience here is that no, that's not true. Young people can be incredibly polished speakers, they can be great writers, they can work on issues as complex as systems change, as long as you sort of give them opportunities to practice and give them feedback.
Okay, so we've built knowledge, we've built skills, we've practiced, and our next step here is to provide a platform. So all that is great, but what are you actually going to do with this stuff that you've done and all this work that you've both put into this work? So this final step is just to draw attention to the fact that you need to provide young team members with a platform to actually act upon, right? And of course that could be anything. It could take many different forms depending on what it is. It could be the service that you're designing. It could be actually doing the health promotion work. It could be a presentation to a dean or a policy recommendations or whatever it is. But it is very important to make sure you end this process with an actual thing so that they can culminate their work in some kind of product, platform, initiative, or just know that they're having a meaningful impact.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of things you should ask yourselves here is what or who do young people need access to in order to sort of meet that common goal that you laid out in the beginning. Oftentimes, young people don't have access to a platform because historically they haven't had access to that platform. So it's important to think about what venues you can make comfortable for young people. You know, it could be sort of hosting a talk and having them speak to their peers. Or it could be low-hanging fruit, like having them involved in a meeting where you're making decisions. It's important that you prep them for that, but it's also important that you think critically about where young voices aren't heard and where they could be heard.
Absolutely. So for us, just quickly, all of our programs are considered our platform. So the chapters where they do their work, or the talks where they're up on stage, or we have a youth advisory board where every time someone asks to speak to us, we usually say, well, why don't you hear it directly from one of them? So passing the microphone wherever possible is something we commit to. But one of our other things that we wanted to speak of is our youth voice report. Mm-hmm. So every year we work to collect and synthesize all of the sort of voices and priorities of our youth network across the country in an annual youth voice report. So this is our 2018 one here. We're making a new one soon, but I'll let Pratik speak to it.
Yeah, one of the platforms we afford young people is within their communities to sort of speak to decision makers so that they can make more systems level change. You know, if there's a policy that they feel is negatively impacting their mental health and their peers' mental health, they can speak to them. But what we've heard is nationally, decision makers want some sort of synthesis that provides a sort of overall view of how our network of young mental health advocates feels are barriers that policymakers need to work towards. And to that end, we draft this youth voice report. What we do is we consult, and it's co-written by mental health advocates from all across the country, and they're young people. They're intimately familiar with barriers in their community, and this is an opportunity for them to speak to decision makers who they may not necessarily get to speak with on a regular basis. And it's really important work that they do on their own. This is how we can help them. An important thing to think about at this stage is this visual is supposed to show you that knowledge and skills work off of this platform. So a platform is somewhere where young people can showcase their knowledge and skills. And sort of immediate next step you can think about is what kind of platform can you provide to a young person right now? It may be, like I said, as simple as in your next general meeting, having a few young people in the room so that they could voice their opinion and bring the youth perspective. So don't overthink it.
Perfect. And our final step and our quickest one here, as we draw to our last 8 minutes before questions, is just to close the loop. So this is understanding, and this is something I think that we've also been guilty of forgetting, is just what happened, like what actually came from all this work that went into this. So I think sometimes we could have a meeting or we could create a report, and it's really, really important that we report back to our young leaders and stakeholders that were involved in the process to say what actually happened, right? Was it used? Did they listen? Did they like it? Are there going to be changes made from your recommendations? Or if you did a health promotion program, like what are the evaluation results? Like how is it going? And it gives them a moment to feel good about the work that they did, to know that it wasn't just like yelling into a black hole. It can also give them the opportunity to reflect, to say like, well, what happened? Did we do a good job? How can we grow? Celebrate successes. And also it's important to tell them if it didn't work, if it sort of fell on deaf ears, if people, this one didn't work, it's not consistent with the priorities of the powers that be, and we'll try again. But it's really just important to make sure you close that loop.
And this is something that most people who work with young people forget, and it's important that they remember it, because if you think about why young people choose to get involved in certain things and not others, it's this piece of being reported back of where their work is going and how they're making progress. So that's super important. When sort of thinking about this process, it may be important for you to think about two separate things. One is progress towards meeting the common goal. So that's the common goal that you and the young person have sort of come to terms with. It may be sort of, promoting youth mental health in a specific community, for example, and thinking about indicators of that common goal and reporting back on it. Another important thing that you should sort of measure and report back on is youth engagement, right? So how satisfied are young people with the youth engagement processes actually in place? And this is very process focused, but it's important because it gives space for young people to sort of give you feedback on how they could be more engaged in this process. Another thing to think about is how can you report this progress to young people? So again, giving options is super important at this stage as well. If it's sort of a 50-page report, likely won't be read. But if it's a short 10-minute meeting about progress that's interactive and has slides and opportunity for sort of discussion, that's more likely to sort of to be well received. And the last piece sort of goes back to the systems of accountability process. So, okay, you haven't met your youth engagement goals for the year. Most young people don't feel like they're engaged like they should be, or what they expected when they sort of agreed to enter this partnership. It's important to hold yourself accountable to that and make improvements and change things and try new things so that both young people and adult allies are satisfied. And this goes both for the youth engagement goals and for any shortcomings towards meeting your common goal as you work through this process. So one of the things we do, of course, is we survey a lot. And it's important we do this because we want to make sure that our programs are doing what they promise. Here's an example of an evaluation survey we use in our talks program. You can see questions over here about being knowledgeable about mental health. So did we actually transfer that mental health knowledge, for example? Another interesting question here is, I'm able to sort of speak in front of an audience of 200 or more. Again, that speaks to the public speaking skills. Did we transfer those? And this is progress towards the common goal. In terms of progress towards youth engagement, we just wrapped up our national summit about 3 weeks ago. Feels like forever ago, but it was fairly recent. And one of the things we ask is, do young people feel heard? Are their needs sort of reflected in national summit content? And this sort of speaks to that youth engagement goal. We want to make sure that we provide room for young people to express their opinions. In terms of next steps, it's important to measure your goal against outcomes. And what this means really is you got to think about indicators towards that goal. So if your goal is as lofty as sort of promoting mental health in your community, how can you break that down? It may be something like improved mental health literacy, for example, among young people in your community, and surveying young people pre and post to find out if there have been any changes. Also, sort of what your youth engagement expectations are. That sort of involves scoping ahead of time how many sort of, for example, how many hours you'll commit to youth engagement, sort of having young people in a room and then holding yourself accountable to that at the end of this process once you measure these outcomes. And the last part, again, can't emphasize this enough, is reporting back on progress. The reason why you'll sort of have young people continue to be involved in your program is if you report back to them and make sure they feel like they're valued stakeholders in this process.
So just to wrap up, we wanted to end with an example of a thing that we recently produced. I just think it's always best to learn from examples and concrete things. So we wanted to share the example of our campus assessment tool, which shows all 5 steps in action, but I think most importantly shows how effective youth engagement and co-production allows you to stay relevant and responsive.
Sure, yeah, and to sort of dig right into it, what we've heard a lot from young people in our network is when we started doing this work, it was in the health and improve mental health knowledge, change attitudes about mental health, so young people were more likely to seek help if they were struggling. But as we've sort of moved and matured in this work, we found that young people reflecting on their communities find that sort of services just don't exist in their communities, and they need access to services. You can sort of encourage someone to seek services till the cows come home, but it's important that those services actually exist so that they're accessible to them.
Till the cows come home.
Till the cows come home. It's also important to sort of have a conversation about what's creating mental health struggle in the first place. With those two things in mind, young people wanted to sort of change systems so that they better support their mental health. So we had several conversations with young people involved in our network about how we could support them in this process. And one of the tools we came up with was this campus assessment tool. And again, it's really important to sort of emphasize that we co-designed this together. It's a tool that's made up of instructions, directives, surveys that young people can use to understand sort of where gaps are in mental health systems in their community. These may be policy-based, this may still be prevalent stigma, but it's important that they understand exactly where gaps are so they can advocate towards improving those gaps with decision makers in their community. So I thought a useful exercise may just be going through our 5 steps of youth engagement as we sort of co-created this tool together and we launched it, where in fact in our pilot year we have about 10 chapters doing the tool right now. The first process, of course, was reflection and preparation. It's a lot of what I just said. Young people wanted to influence local systems because they realized that this sort of grassroots education campaign wasn't working as well, and that young people were more literate. They just wanted accessible services in their community. And then, of course, we had to engage in this process of knowledge transfer. That was a big deal for me because it was my first big project here in terms of doing this knowledge translation work, and it was me sort of understanding how systems work and then imparting that knowledge to young people through several resources. We sort of came up with a chapter training that walks them through what a system is, how a system can change, etc. And then it was a conversation about developing skills, and that's what the campus assessment tool does. Really, it develops their research and analysis skills. Those are skills they can use to understand where sort of systems gaps are in their community as it relates to mental health. But there are also important research and analysis skills that they can use in their future careers. They can certainly use it in their schoolwork. And so it was very important that we emphasized that. The last piece was providing a platform. So one of the things we did was, now young people know where sort of gaps in mental health systems are in their community. We encourage them to reach out to decision makers, and we've had positive responses. People inviting them to meetings so that they can discuss where gaps are and how they can work together collaboratively to address some of those gaps. Another sort of platform we provided, we spoke about this earlier, was a youth voice report. So we sort of collect that information back and we reflect it in the youth voice report. So when decision makers come knocking on our doors, we sort of have this opportunity to impart this platform with them. And the last piece is closing the loop. So it's super important that young people know where this information is going, and we talk to them about the youth voice report and how this pilot will influence the youth voice report. But I also have monthly calls with them all the time, and I update them on progress that they're making. We have a conversation about how they can work towards some of the challenges they see, and I also update them on their peers. So, for example, U Ottawa may be curious about how Queen's campus assessment tool is going, and this is an important time for us to share that information so they feel like they're valued stakeholders, which of course they are.
And so that's it from us. So those are our 5 broad steps. We do hope that they are generalizable enough, and there are some key learnings in there for anyone who's looking to create initiatives or programs with youth for youth in a campus environment or in any environment really, anywhere hopefully. We hope we've offered something we can take away so you can consider opportunities for youth engagement or maybe integrate it more intentionally into the work that you're doing. And most importantly, I think we hope that we've sold you that while youth engagement can be a more time-intensive process than considered, the benefits far outweigh the effort involved. Your work will be more relevant to young people. It will be more sustainable. It'll have a much stronger impact directly related to needs of young people in anything you're doing if youth are meaningfully engaged in co-production. And if you have questions, we would love to answer them for these last 15 minutes here. But thank you for joining us for this webinar today.
Thank you very much.
That's it.
Thank you so much, Pratik and Sarah. That was a really great presentation. So we do have some questions already rolling in. First question. How do you deal with the difference of opinion around different initiatives? For example, if some student groups want something and others don't, how do you ensure that you make everyone feel like their voice has been heard, even if you can't always incorporate all the varying opinions?
So specific to student initiatives, in our chapter program, we don't necessitate any initiatives at all. So we go through our training, which involves a community reflection, an annual plan, all that kind of stuff, but students don't have to do anything. So if we also have an initiative bank, because it's easier to work from a rough draft than a blank page, and students can look at them, and then they ultimately decide what's relevant for their own communities. So response to initiatives is sort of how we do that. But on our youth advisory board with a difference of opinion, there's always, they always have a difference of opinion. And ultimately, it's just hard. It's just general conflict negotiation all the time. Like we were deciding the theme for this year's summit, it took days. But while we were doing it, we all decided that the goal was to advance our network towards systems change. And people had different wordsmithing things, but I think we just always work to go back to the main goal and make sure people have a general consensus around that. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to support 250 young leaders from every province and territory. How are we going to do that? Does this conversation that we're having ultimately help us do that? And people usually align in that way, or they cut their losses if we're arguing ultimately about whether a thing should be green or like yellow. Like, you know, these little battles, often I find the disagreements are in the gravy, but usually we can get a pretty clear consensus on the goal of the thing, the timeline of the thing, and what we're trying to do together.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I think that question says something positive about the situation that this person is in, because young people are not a monolith, right? And it's clear from that question that you've engaged a diverse group of young people who have different ideas. Mm-hmm. I think personally, and I'm sure Sarah would agree, that this sort of creates, it engages in the process of co-production of a resource that is ultimately better, because you're not sitting in an echo chamber just having your own thoughts validated.
Yeah, and it brings us back to our main tenet of our how, not what sort of sentiment. So ultimately, if our 15 young people disagree on what they're going to do, at least we can all have a common understanding that, okay, we need to build, like, what's the evidence? Like, we need to build a common understanding that everybody has mental health, everybody can struggle sometimes, here's what the red flags look like, and maybe you all disagree because you're coming at it from diverse perspectives, and how do we make sure the work we're doing can apply in each of those situations? So we don't actually need to find a common consensus, we need to make sure we're making things that work in diverse environments.
Right, yeah, it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all project, it may be sort of replicating that project and adapting it to different situations.
That's a great answer. Next question. You covered in step 5 that it's important to discuss the young people's progress, but do you also point out any gaps or areas of improvement?
Constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Like, we have a pretty strong, we don't shy away from negative feedback. We have a fail forward approach. Like, if things aren't working, I think it would be a huge disservice to not include that information.
Absolutely, yeah, no, that candor is so important, and it's most important because, okay, you have several problems with your program. The people who sort of come prepared with solutions are probably the young people you engage with. So if it's sort of a you sheepishly admit that the youth engagement process that you went through didn't sort of have the results you wanted or you forecasted in the beginning, young people will give you valid, sort of honest responses on how you can improve that, because they're invested in this, of course.
Yeah, I'll give an example. Our youth advisory board is in its 4th year, mm-hmm. and last year we had a policy where we had these monthly phone calls and these working groups, and it just was not working. It wasn't working for anybody. We were trying our best, but you know, it's new. I always say, like, we're doing a creative thing, and maybe it might not. Pratik's probably so sick of hearing me say that, but we're doing a creative thing. It might not work, and let's just constantly chat about. So what's not working about these monthly calls? The timeline is inconsistent with what we're working on. It's too onerous. We need something else, and then ultimately we worked together and made something better. So the answer to this question is absolutely. We always share negative and positive feedback, and we always use it to make something better.
Absolutely.
Amazing. And a next question, can you share any examples of some of your students who have been engaged on campus in terms of the campus mental health strategies and how that has worked out?
So, sure, yeah. So this campus assessment tool is so what we've noticed is that young people, yeah, they've been invited to the table to sort of speak about mental health strategies, policy, how sort of institutions can work to best support young people's mental health. What we found is that young people could speak to that anecdotally. So, you know, for example, if I was at U of T, I could speak to my experience of not being able to access a service, or my friend's experience of not being able to access a service. we thought it'd be more powerful if there was a tool that sort of had them survey several young people on their campus and then sort of present the results of that tool to a decision maker. So that's sort of where the campus assessment tools come from. It's from sort of increasingly young people being invited to decision-making tables, which is a very positive thing for our chapter program specifically. And we hope that at the end of this pilot year, they'll be prepared going into the fall with specific sort of gaps that they can collaborate with decision makers on.
Mm-hmm. On the other side of that, I can speak to, just off the top of my head, I can think of 5 different students who've been invited on different advisory committees or like there's that thing that Brian, doesn't matter, a bunch of different advisory things, and they're invited to it, but they often come to us and they say, oh my God, like I didn't know how to answer that question, or like one of our students is quite bright, he's on this other committee about lived experience, and they were talking about outcomes, and he is a theater student, and he didn't know how to engage on a conversation around meaningful outcomes and evaluation, and he was like, I'm way out of my depth, I don't know how to do this, and he just called us, and I ended up chatting with him for like an hour and just teaching him that concept, and then he was able to engage much more meaningfully. So oftentimes students are brought onto these advisory committees and they are speaking anecdotally or doing their best, but we are often working to fill in knowledge gaps or supplement their information so that they can engage meaningfully, and it's a good thing that we're able to do.
Absolutely, and again, like off the top of my head, a more formal sort of example of that is one of our students at U-Windsor who sat on the Mental Health and Wellness Committee, in an advisory role, in this sort of advise and consent role for Senate decision items. So, they got access to specifically what decision items were on the table and got to voice their opinion on it. It wasn't a vote, of course, but is like a really cool way of how they can influence mental health systems change.
Amazing. Next question, how do you select who you invite to be part of this conversation? Anyone, everyone, select the leaders?
We struggle with that. We were just talking, our department meeting was about diversity and representation. And one of the gaps is that we are a youth leadership and advocacy charity. So we ultimately have young people who are standing up to take on a leadership role, which is a selection bias, right? Self-selection into the thing. And what we do is we support, our mandate is to support any young person who stands up and wants to make a change, and that's awesome. But we always have some kind of training, thought, consideration, reflection around who are you representing, whose voice isn't at this table, and how can you bring it there? So if a young person stands up and they're all the same, they're all, international students from the engineering department or whatever, we make sure that if they're going to be at decision-making tables, if they're going to be on an advisory board, like how can we make sure they're canvassing their campus environment, reaching out, partnering effectively, and bringing multiple diverse voices to what they're doing. For our own advisory board, we have sort of diversity criteria. It's a competitive process, and there's different things built into that. But generally for our programs, we encourage diversity, we encourage reflexivity, and we make sure young people are always able to canvas and get as many diverse voices as possible.
Yeah, and to sort of riff off that a little bit, one of the important things to recognize is that, it's probably a broader commentary on volunteerism. We sort of, our programs aren't paid, we sort of help cover expenses, etc. And those things are important to consider, right? So just sort of having a low barrier to involvement, making sure that there's some sort of incentive to participate, or at least covering costs that young people may incur. The other really important thing, I think, is also candor around who you do represent. So in our Youth Voice report, for example, we have demographic data up there, and we're very clear about we're not representative of every single young person in Canada. We're representative of a group of young mental health advocates who are involved in our program. They're intimately familiar with barriers in their community, but they're certainly not every single young person in Canada. Exactly. And that's super important, just having sort of that candor up front of what you are and what you're not.
And finally, if you notice gaps in your representation, so 3 years ago, we had almost no Indigenous representation, for example, in our programming. And that was a question for us. But as I said before, if you have a gap, you have a question, like ask it, right? You can do engagement to solve these things. And we had partnerships in schools in the north, and and we chatted, and we were like, what does youth leadership look like here? Who is standing up? What are you interested in? We had a series of focus groups. We had all this cultural competency training. We did all these meaningful partnerships, and then we started to see an uptake of our chapters and our talks in the North. Similarly, in Francophone Canada, all of our resources were in English first, and we've been translating, we've been partnering, we've been co-producing to make sure things stay relevant and responsive. But in order to be more effective, that's something we've committed to, but we don't solve those questions on our own. We ask the young people we're working with, and then we move forward in whatever direction they say.
Thank you, Sarah. We only have time for one last question. So last question is, on our campus, we have been struggling a little bit with student engagement in the sense that some of the student groups that we try to engage, there's a lot of frustration and irritation around there not being enough resources to serve students. So it can be difficult to have a conversation surrounding student engagement. How do we overcome that?
I can jump in here. Yeah, so I think part of that is that report back on progress, right? So I think that's a large part of why students don't get engaged in formal sort of governance structures that are available to them to voice their opinion. It's because they don't feel like progress is being made. And listen, in terms of outcomes, progress may not be made, so you may not have more mental health services on campus in this sort of academic year than you did last academic year. But it's important to report back even on processes so that people know that you tried to do that. And I think that's honestly maybe the biggest thing, and reporting back on progress and sort of having communication with young people like, listen, we hear your advice, this is why it didn't work out, is crucial and important for them to sort of not be disillusioned and continue being involved in that process.
That's exactly right. I would just add, I just wrote down transparency, right? So like if we're working with young people and you just can't make certain changes and you're sensing frustration, being transparent around why that is. Like, I'm hearing this, and also I'm hearing this, here's the reality, here's what I have, and here's what's going on, right? So not just saying, no, I can't, but bringing people into the conversation. And in general, conflict resolution and conversations, I have a personal policy. I always say, get on the same side of the table, right? So I bet that you in this situation, or everybody wants more accessible services and better services on campuses, and being open about that and saying, I hear your frustration. What are we frustrated about? Where are the gaps? I want to know. I'm eager to hear. And I'm on this side of the table where this is what I'm seeing. Let's get it all out on the table and see where we can take steps, where we can't, and what's the reality together.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking that young people are sort of lazy or don't want to sort of be part of this process. They do, but you can see why, if you sort of put yourselves in their shoes, why they would be disillusioned if they don't hear back, right? So I engaged in like 3 focus groups last year. I attended committee meetings, and none of sort of my opinions were reflected in changes. It's really important to report back and not sort of take the easy way out of saying, throwing your hands up in the air and being like, oh.
Or just forgetting. Yeah. I think people just forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it was a really great point. And I think that idea of transparency and progress report could not just be applied to students, but really anybody on campus when you're trying to rearrange things or you're trying to brainstorm about new strategies, new initiatives.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. It was an excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended this presentation. Our next webinar is on April 25th, and we're going to be talking about young caregivers in the post-secondary environment. So please check our website for the registration link. And don't forget our survey, which is going to pop up at the end of the webinar. Any last thoughts, you guys?
Thank you for those questions. They were really good.
Yeah,
and we had a lot of fun doing this.
Yes. We are constantly making resources around youth engagement and looking for opportunities to share them. So if you have questions, you want to speak further, we would be thrilled to talk about it.
Amazing. Well, thanks again. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.